Welcome, listeners, to the latest episode of the AdQuick Madvertising Podcast, a podcast that explores the intersection of technology, marketing, culture, all of the things that you care about. Today, we have two very interesting guests. I'm excited to have two guests. I think this is the first or second time we've had two guests on the show. We have Kat Stern, Vice President of Authentic.org, and Celina Lin, who is Associate Director at Authentic.org. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Of course.
Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
And so sometimes I do this, but I was thinking today it might be good for our guests to do this since we have two of you. If you could just give us a brief intro for all of our listeners that might not know, what is Authentic.org, and a little bit into some context as to what you both do there.
Yeah, for sure. I can start. Authentic is an organization that does paid media and email fundraising, as well as content and all other types of things, pretty much all things digital for political candidates and advocacy groups on the left. So me and Celina are on the paid media team, where we run paid media campaigns in terms of like online fundraising, as well as on the persuasion side, which is kind of like more like upper funnel awareness campaigns for these campaigns and candidates.
Awesome. And Celina, your role?
Hello. So I work at Authentic with Kat, obviously, and just help support a lot of her work and do a lot of kind of the day-to-day and work with a team of clients with the team at hand to just make sure everything's running smoothly and work a lot on kind of the planning side, as well as the creative and execution side of a lot of our ad campaigns.
Awesome. And so, a lot of our guests are on the business side and then the technology side. So you're kind of a first guest for us on the political side. And I think it's really interesting for people not in your world to get a little bit of maybe a temperature check of where you're at being a digital agency from a political fundraising standpoint. How is everything feeling for you? And I ask this question because I think on the business side, it's been like some sectors are doing well. Some sectors are, kind of getting through a little bit of a dark time, but I'm curious how you all are faring right now.
Yeah, I think a lot, like anything else in digital, like is just so much is changing in the space constantly. Online fundraising is sort of experiencing some new changes and challenges. I think there's been some really positive aspects to it. Like, I feel like one of the biggest challenges on the political side is just getting campaign managers and advocacy groups we work with to like take digital very seriously. It seems like we've gotten there, or we're getting there. We're very close to that. And just for some context, political can be a little bit more behind than like general corporate advertising when it comes to like TV buying versus digital buying. My background is originally in the corporate space, so I really was able to see the stark difference when I came into it. But I also, to kind of jump back to the fundraising piece, basically like the way we've like built our email programs and built our fundraising programs, like the way we acquire emails to help grow these email lists have changed. Facebook used to sort of be like the silver bullet, but it's not really like quite the moneymaker and like sort of the end all place for acquisition that we were once seeing. I think a lot of that has to do with like some of the privacy changes that Facebook has rolled out, and they did some like self-regulation when it comes to targeting and things like that. Like we used to have like more niche targeting available to us. Like we could do targeting specific to someone's party preference, and now that's no longer. We have to be a little bit more creative about how we do that. But we're also seeing that even names that are applying like or acquiring on Facebook aren't always paying back. And I can have Celina speak a little bit more to that because she's a little more specialized on that side. But anyway, I just think some of this in general changes more broadly how firms right now are thinking about the work and the work we're doing for our clients. And I'm assuming that, given the way digital tends to move, we'll have to continue to adapt and change and make sure we're delivering the best services.
Right on.
Yeah. And I think even like zooming out a little further from that too, like I think one of the biggest differences between political work and pretty much any other thing you will do, is that political is so cyclical. You kind of go through, I mean, like there's some exceptions, but for the most part, your even years are much busier. The second half of those years are much busier. And then come after election day, so like by mid-November, everything has pretty much ground to a halt. And I would say like generally, I think this year folks were a lot of folks were really fatigued from 2022, from 2020. So I think we got a bit of a slower start to the year, I would say, across the industry. I think campaigns were launching a little bit later than they maybe had, I think, like immediately after 2020. And especially in 2017, 2018, you were seeing campaigns launch immediately because there's just so much energy. I think we haven't quite seen that to the same extent, but I don't think it's still very different from like a tech marketing type situation where the money is dried up a little bit more. And this is more kind of like where we sit in the cycle. And by Q1, Q2 of next year, we would expect a lot of stuff to be ramping up.
Right on. Yeah. So you'd mentioned that the nature of the game has changed a little bit. Have folks in your space that kind of embraced distributed work? Like, are people going into the office? I have to ask because you did mention that the political organizations are a little bit behind in terms of their adoption. But is remote a thing for folks in this space?
Well, Authentic is totally remote. We do have like offices available in space if you want to use that. That's at your own. The company will let you do that, and you can do that yourself. But we're completely remote. I think during the pandemic, and I know this is kind of a common thing that people talk about, but we learned that we can do this work remote. And like to Celina's point about it being so cyclical, like it's so demanding at different times that being physically in an office, I don't think really like makes that much of a difference if that's helpful context. And like I think allowing for like flexibility is a really good thing with this type of work, and like will hopefully prevent some burnout. Like I think this work can be really challenging in terms of like when there's like high energy moments, kind of like Celina was talking about, and it can be exhausting in different ways. And so trying to mitigate as much as possible. And I think like having flexibility is definitely helpful. But also like as a digital firm, our work is digital, like we're online all the time. And we were very, very easily able to do that during the pandemic. So I think that just kind of continued for a lot of firms. And then some other firms I know are doing like sort of a hybrid model. Celina, not sure what you've heard in the space, but like, I think a lot of places are doing like, 3 days, a couple days a week out, and vice versa. So I think that works as well for them.
Yeah. And I think too, with the nature of political, like your clients are never going to be concentrated all in one location. Like there's certainly some states that we tend to do a little bit more work in, but not to the point where we like would have an Arizona office or something like that. So I think by having this flexible remote model, we've seen a lot of agencies adopt that. I think because you're not meeting with your clients in person very often, and most of the time the people you're communicating with are on these client teams, you have to get on a call anyways. Like I know there's times Kat and I will both go into an office and sit together and we'll join the same call, but like still will not be in a room joining it together. I think a lot of those just realities of it, we've found that it's not worth the constraints of forcing everyone to be in a select group of cities. And as a result, I think we've been able to draw a really diverse team with different backgrounds without telling all of them, hey, you have to move to Washington, D.C. or New York City. I think it's given folks a lot more flexibility that they really appreciate.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen talking to a lot of our users is the really competent teams can ship from anywhere. They could ship from a conference hotel, they could ship from an office, from their home, and they're sort of empowered to do that. And then what you see really is it's a lot of either kind of old guard legacy teams where they're like, oh, I gotta walk through and see everyone, working, which with digital work, it's like, okay, well, you can see people on your laptop anywhere. Or it's unfortunately, some people use it as a crutch to maybe lay off the team or restructure. And so, but the other area, we see a lot of companies do be in person is if it's like brand new day one for the startup, and it's just like they're even like figuring out like product market fit and what they're even doing. And so like creating that structure is sometimes helpful. But I think for like a team like yourself, that's everyone's super competent. It's like the location's not the point. It's the team and the processes and the work. So I love to see that. You know, you mentioned politics lags behind corporate America. This is one area where, you know, maybe you guys have an opportunity to lead corporate America.
I will say though, I can't speak for like some of the like TV or mail firms and what their policies are in return to work. Because I imagine that might be a little bit different on that side versus like some of the digital firms.
So one thing that you all probably have some interesting insights for your marketing peers that are probably sitting marketing consumer goods, whether it's like a D2C consumer product or even a Coke or Pepsi, is how do you see Gen Z changing the culture on the internet? And like any thoughts on, you know, how does that impact how you talk to voters and how you market, and maybe any insights that you might have for someone who doesn't see the world, you know, through the eyes of what you do?
So I think this is in some ways a very interesting question for political, because I think Gen Z is absolutely changing the internet, and we're seeing trends emerge every day that we could never have predicted the day before. And young voters are very important politically. However, I think for like the core, I don't know, I would say like 50, 60, 70% of our work, so much of that is still targeting older voters. They tend to be the most likely to vote, especially in a primary context. They are the people that show up. I think that's part of the reason why, as an industry as a whole, the political marketing ecosystem is still so reliant on TV relative to other verticals. But because of that, I think we still end up in a place where, yes, there's a lot of changing trends, but at the same time, a lot of our work is still staying largely the same, and the tactics are still similar. And I think where we're doing a lot of the cutting edge stuff does tend to be when we're talking to younger voters. So like I know Kat and I talk a lot about vertical video and thinking about what we're going to be doing. Like, for example, on Instagram Reels this cycle, I think we're starting to test it out for fundraising. But I think for persuasion awareness programs, that's going to be a really critical piece to the program. We're doing a lot more influencer work as a firm. I think that's something that political campaigns are really trying to get a good handle on. That's emerging as a really important way of reaching folks this cycle. So those are kind of the biggest changes that we're tracking. But even just the style of the content, I was telling a client the other day, I was like, whereas maybe we traditionally would have cut an ad with a veteran talking direct to camera, we can still somewhat do that for a younger audience, but what they're saying, they may be talking faster. They may be talking in a much more direct way. And I think all of those changes, like you see platforms like TikTok, Instagram Reels, where the content is just shorter, I think that's something that's also really top of mind for us.
Yeah, and I think what another part that came to mind when Celina was talking is like, I think the bottom line is that we're not just taking a TV ad and slapping it into any digital platform. Like that's not how we're thinking about it. I think Gen Z in general has just like changed the way the internet works. Like it has, obviously paved the way for like how TikTok looks and feels today, the content that you're seeing there, how like Instagram Reels content looks. Like we want to make sure that we're taking kind of what exists already and like putting our ads into that platform in a way that feels really native and isn't just, again, like taking a TV ad and throwing it in there, like actually thinking about what feels really organic and what feels really relevant to those platforms and creating ads that way.
Right on.
Yeah, one thing I saw when I was during the pandemic, I was at a company doing a bunch of D2C software, and I found that, like Celina was saying, the ads that looked like content on Insta and Facebook and even Twitter, like the click-through rate and like the view-through rate and conversion was all higher. I think because, people think it's real content, and you've got those few seconds to at least hook them. So do you think, I want to follow up that question. Do you think, so you mentioned we try to make it not look like a TV ad online, which I think makes sense. do you think that younger people or just the internet more broadly maybe is sort of averse to advertising at this point because of maybe things marketers have done for years to kind of have like really annoying ads in front of people? Like any sense on that?
I think for young people, absolutely. I think
we're tired.
I think most of my friends all have ad blockers of some sort. And I think that is something I think about constantly, especially as we talk about how to reach young voters. I think influencer work is a lot of like how we kind of look at getting around some of that. But yeah, I think absolutely that is something that is top of mind for a lot of folks, or at least should be. But kind of going back to what you were saying about the native looking things, like that's a really strong trend we've seen on the fundraising side. I would say probably in like the last year or so, the industry at large has like really doubled down on what we call these like native looking ads. So I think a lot of ads that you see on Facebook from political fundraisers are much more photography based than they used to be. Like a lot of times it's just a simple photo versus I think like conventional wisdoms that, you need a cutout of your candidate's face with some short blurb and a button that says donate now. And we've done a lot of testing and seen even that like having the difference of the button that says donate now versus not saying that doesn't really make a difference in performance, and that native feeling content can actually outperform.
Yeah, and just to add to kind of what Adam, you mentioned about like kind of on the awareness persuasion side, last cycle, so that was in 22, we had a partnership with House Majority PAC where we took influencer content and turned them into ads. So we were able to actually like target the audiences, because obviously when you're running influencer content, there's always restrictions on how like targeted you can get because it's running organically. And yeah, for those ads that we created that had like a very like organic look and feel, it was actual influencer content. We saw like our performance drastically improve just having that content in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of using internet influencers in ads. I mean, I wasn't a fan. I'm just gonna be honest. I wasn't a fan of much of the last series of Super Bowl ads, but actually the one thing I remember was Mr. Beast was in an ad. I can't even remember the name of the brand, which that's not great, but he was in an ad, and I was like, hey, that's kind of cool that one brand is like, that's like the one brand that thought to put like a non-trad influencer into some of their paid marketing. I'm like, good for them. Maybe it was an insurance company. I can't remember the ad, which is bad.
I'm sure they paid him a lot.
Yeah, I remember the Coinbase ad just because they did something different. That's like the one ad. It's stupid, but they did something different, and I think like it in some regard, a lot of marketers have gotten stuck in creating these ads that are, like you mentioned, they look like everything else. That I think when you see ads that are kind of cool or creative, you're like, hey, that's different. That stands out. That was interesting for me. So I want to see advertisers get back to that.
Kat, you were talking about the importance of having that native feel. I have a question around how you're treating new channels and new opportunities. And so, like, we're on a podcast. Podcasts weren't big last cycle, I would argue. And how are kind of like campaign managers and digital directors thinking about this medium now as a part of their their efforts?
Like audio ads, for example, like running ads. I think since 2020, I mean, we ran audio ads in 2020. I was very passionate about it. I do think it's really important because I think that's where a lot of people are spending their time. We want to meet people where they are. Audio is a place to do it. I will say that as a person who advocates for digital audio, it usually is like one of the first things to get cut from a plan. Like if you have to choose between certain tactics, that can be one. For some context, when a lot of the targeting that we do, like, how a corporate brand would match to an email list that they have in some way, like for persuasion advertising, we match to the voter file. Like we can actually access voter information and use that to target voters online. There's a lot of complicated aspects of why the data isn't perfect and that sort of thing, but it's still like the closest proxy that we have to kind of understand like how people vote, when they have voted, that sort of thing. And a lot of the times we find that because of the scale and the complications with matching these lists, or the voter list rather, trying to do that through audio is really challenging. And that's kind of why I think it does end up getting cut. And then also just, I'm not sure that everyone fully understands the value yet. So it's been kind of like a thing that I've been definitely pushing for. I think me and Celina have been kind of on the front line of that a little bit.
I will also say, I think something that has not helped is a lot of streaming audio platforms at various points in time have had various restrictions on political advertising. So I think it was kind of the thing where like you could do it, but you can't buy it by show. You can buy it only across Audience Network in this very broad way. And then the next month it goes away for the next 6 months. So I think there's been a lot of uncertainty around it too, which like, as Kat mentioned, like the two of us have been pitching it, but I think because it comes and goes, it's not a part of like the core ethos in the way that like Facebook programmatic CTV is something that is always there. I mean, I think even you see that a little bit with Twitter too, like because Twitter ads went away for so long, a lot of people have been really reluctant and or just aren't going back to it because I mean, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on with Twitter, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. It's not as much a part of the existing toolkit in a way, and there's just other things to spend money on. And most of these campaigns always have 10 things they want to do and money to do 3.
Would it be fair to say that, you know, like the one-to-many channels get deprioritized for something that's a little bit more concrete in terms of like attribution and targeting?
I will say that, yeah, I'm not sure if that's necessarily it for audio. I think what I was thinking when I was sitting here too is we've run a lot of programmatic audio in the past, which kind of like helps avoid what Celina was mentioning with like the different political restrictions and hoops you have to jump through. Like it'll serve where it can serve, where we're like, you know, where we don't have like limitations. I guess, yeah, there's not like a ton like of data that we can pull beyond knowing like when someone's listened to the ad, but like when it comes to persuasion advertising, that's kind of the name of the game. Like the typical persuasion ads, we're reaching voters who don't necessarily want to hear our message. So I actually think audio, because it's non-skippable, is like a good place to do that. Although I know you can kind of skip through with the 15-second thing. But yeah, like a lot of the times the challenge is we want to serve ads that are non-skippable with sound on. If there's a visual, having the visual as you know, as large as possible in view, where I think audio kind of can answer that for us. But again, I just think it's maybe there's a little bit of a late adoption there that we're kind of up against.
I'm actually really bullish audio ads. Like I listen to them. I listen to audio podcasts when I'm at the gym. Now that I don't live in the city, I'm like outside Austin. Like I listen to like broadcast radio, which, you know, there's different ways you can run those via programmatic tools online. I do want to go back to something Celina said, because there's a lot of ad techs that listen to us. Celina said something interesting. She said, you know, once we stop using a platform to run ads, whether it's a social network or something else, it sort of falls out of our mix. And so I would say for anyone who's building on the you know, platform side, you definitely want to be consistent, whether it's to political marketers, whether it's we have cannabis marketers. There's certain other areas where I think it's probably really important to be consistent in how you treat that market, because, you know, otherwise you're going to do marketing and get people who are sitting in the shoes of Kat and Celina using your platform. And if it's not predictable of what they can do in the future, you know, you could lose them. So I think that was an important learning probably for a lot of people listening.
Yeah. And I think that even just with like client education about platforms too, like anytime a lot of times you're pitching them on something new, you have to get them on board. And at a certain point, people decide it's not worth the trouble, or, you know, too much time has passed and like these people don't know anything about audio and I don't have the time to fully get them there. Let's just plus up our YouTube buy or try this other thing. But I do think there's like teams of reps at each of these places that advocate, but even sometimes they'll allow federal ads, but not state level ads. And things like that get very complicated quickly, or they'll allow nonprofit advertising, but not C4, but will allow candidate advertising. I think different different platforms run the full gamut of combinations of stuff. We track it very carefully on our end, but I mean, I'm sure there's certainly marketers out there that don't have the resources to track every single thing, and clients that just get confused at a certain point.
Yeah, I think
I am pro letting people advertise politically, obviously, but I'm also biased.
Same.
I think you talked me out of doing political advertising because of all of the hoops. I think the worst sector I ever worked in, though, was still financial. So financial was actually worse than I was in pharma as well.
I was going to say, I feel like pharma.
Pharma was
is
fine.
The worst.
Pharma was fine. The lawyers in pharma are actually pretty cool. They'll review your stuff straight away and be like, this is fine. Just change this. You have the medical team look. Okay. The finance people with like FINRA and these various orgs, you get these like bureaucratic people that are at these associations that have to touch everything. And it just becomes this like, to get like a simple blog post approved takes just too much work. So I imagine that's still worse than political. Like the financial people are crazy.
I mean, they could just skip everything, all that whole process by having a big asterisk, not investment advice.
Well, or you could just skip everything and sell cryptocurrencies, and there's no regulation, and people lose all their money. So
for now.
Chris, you have the next question?
Yeah. So I typically, usually when we have our guests on, I like to jump into metrics and kind of understand like how you guys track your progress, how you track whether it's something is working or not. And so I'd love to get a sense of like, how do you know that you're, what are the best in class organizations? What are they looking at on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis? Obviously, we know what the end result should be, right? If you did your job, then said candidate gets elected. But kind of I'd love to get walked through like how you think about running the campaign and like what you're looking at on a monthly and quarterly basis.
So I think one of the things you just said of like looking at things on a monthly or quarterly basis, I think is actually very interesting because we almost never do something in political on a quarterly basis. Okay. Because kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, if you're looking at that, like a lot of persuasion programs will run for 8 to 12 weeks, right? And that is the program. And you're probably doing 2 or 3 flights within it if you have the resources too. Now that's like if you're doing a larger Senate campaign, you probably have the resources to start earlier than that. And like we've done a lot of work on like earlier persuasion programs and what a lower level plan can look like in the months leading up to it. But we're really looking at things on a daily to weekly basis.
I was way off.
Which is just a very different mentality than people coming from corporate. Like everything is always on fire in a different way, but you get used to it. But you're dealing with much shorter flights, much shorter turnaround times. As Kat kind of alluded to earlier, on the persuasion front, we're looking at reach and frequency and making sure the other metrics are within acceptable ranges of what we would expect and that nothing looks kind of too out of the norm. On the fundraising side, I think you have to keep a much closer eye on it. Like we check all of our fundraising ads on a daily basis, and we're really just optimizing towards ROI for the vast majority of our clients. I think there's a couple that are going to be more CPA based, but for the most part, we're looking at immediate revenue, but then on a monthly and quarterly basis, evaluating lifetime value of those names and making sure that things are in line with what we would expect. But at this point, like we have a good amount of data that kind of indicates if your immediate returns look like this, your lifetime returns will probably track roughly similarly. So those things will take a step back and look at a little more infrequently, but the timelines are still just much more condensed.
Well, LTV is still the same between corporate and political. So,
right.
Hey, I guess if you're a political marketer, you can go corporate marketer can go political. You're speaking the same language.
Yeah, it's definitely the same language. Just some of the Kat can talk to this. The applications are just different.
Yeah, for sure. Coming from corporate, there was definitely some things like even just, and to your point, Chris, like I also did like more like direct response when I was at Amazon advertising. And that was like a very ROAS heavy, like those campaigns are very ROAS heavy. And I also had a lot of like more awareness campaigns that I worked on. Like it's kind of when like CTV was like just emerging, and looking at how we treated Amazon advertising programs and political fundraising programs. There is some overlap, but there are some really hefty differences. So there was definitely like a little bit of a learning curve, but I do think like, like anything else, advertising is advertising. No matter what industry you're in, you can pick it up. But I was going to mention that I think Celina like brought up an interesting point about the weeks situation that I wanted to talk about a little bit more. TV buyers traditionally buy in weeks, like they literally count back from the election, and that's like what week they're at in the basically leading up to it, and that's how they buy. So for like the digital side, we definitely have to like consider that and think about that. But I think the more like broader thing is that getting campaigns and advocacy groups to invest in persuasion much earlier than like 8 weeks out from the election, 12 weeks out from the election is challenging. Where in corporate marketing, a lot of campaigns have like an always on strategy, or brands rather have an always on strategy where they're always investing, they're always spending money on paid media, where advertising for campaigns, it's kind of like a sprint. You go from nothing to a sprint. And like what some data that we've been seeing, like I quoted a study at Swayable in this article I put together, is that actually investing well out before these 8 weeks, like looking at 6 months earlier, can move voters up to two times as much as when you get to this like more crowded space closer to the election, where you're, obviously fighting for eyeballs and fighting for, frankly, like the financial aspect, where as you get closer, obviously CPMs are increased and that sort of thing. So I think more broadly, like just some of the fight that me and Celina have kind of brought to our campaigns is that investing early actually does really pay off. And just running a campaign, 8 weeks out and not really giving your voters any like sort of groundwork leading up to that is not really the best approach. And I think, of course, there's, limitations when it comes to funding and that sort of thing. Like you have to, like these campaigns have to fundraise and raise money in order to spend persuasion dollars, which is always a challenge. But when they have it, we definitely try to recommend it because it really does. Their dollars just go further, frankly.
That makes sense. So we covered. So I was way off on the metrics piece, but one other question I had about how you do. I always like looking under the hood, but another question I had is like how much has the new technologies influenced how you put together ad campaigns? Like, are you using any of the AI stuff? Are we doing any creative in Midjourney? Maybe shed some light around that.
I could start with that one. I feel like the question like a lot right now I'm hearing in the like election space is how is AI going to impact elections this cycle? And I feel like my answer is pretty lame, but it's always like, I don't know. I don't know. Like there's like some real things that are happening. Like there's tools being built. Like maybe you've heard our CEO, Mike Nellis, is working on a tool called Quiller, that is focusing on like creating power to more quickly write like fundraising emails, which will obviously like really increase the speed of our work, which is like very important to getting fundraising emails out, especially when there's like sort of like something in the news cycle that requires like a quick response, what political calls rapid response. There are a ton of companies right now that are reaching out to me about doing like AI generated voiceovers for podcast ads, kind of about what we were just talking about for audio. I think it really comes down to like if the campaigns are willing to embrace it and the level of comfort we have. And Celina could go into this too. We have used Midjourney for some fun stuff at Authentic, but I think I'm not sure we're at the place where we're going to be generating images of candidates and putting them up as ads yet. And I'm not opposed to it. I'm just not sure that the level of comfort is there yet. I do think that on the like in the independent expenditure side, which is sort of like where you see PAC ads and that sort of thing, and a lot of those ads are negative, I feel like that could potentially be more of a route that campaigns and advocacy groups and PACs are more comfortable taking. But it's, for us, we're the practitioners, right? So like we're going to do what our clients are comfortable with and what we need to do. So that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's still like, even with like some candidates, there's reluctance to use stock images of people in their ads that they want to have a shoot and have their own people there, right? So that like there's not a press story saying that they hired whatever. So like I think at the point where you're also still doing that, I personally would be surprised if we saw a lot of candidates using AI to generate creative in a way that was like to mimic a human. Like something Kat's referencing is like this image we did during Shark Week, which was around the time when Barbie was really big, of like a Barbie themed shark that was created with Midjourney. Really, like, I don't think anyone thought that we actually took a photo of this shark and it was one thing, but I think, you know, to like create an AI image of someone's opponent, I'd be a little surprised if candidate clients make it there. I think on the group side, it's a little different, but I think the other thing that kind of underlies all of this too is I think there's an expectation at this point within the industry that there are going to be some bad actors misusing AI to mislead in this election. I think that's something that keeps me up at night. I don't think we know exactly how it's going to occur, but I think at this point, most people assume it's going to be happening in some form or fashion. So I think because of that too, there's also just an extra layer of caution that everyone wants to take with this compared to like what a Coke or Pepsi maybe could get away with doing.
Yeah,
because it has the potential to spin into something much larger.
Yeah.
On the brand side, something that we've seen time and time again is the brands who are totally cool with their users, remixing them, making memes, using AI tools. Those are the ones that tend to win the hearts and minds of consumers versus the brands and, you know, organizations who are like, no, I don't like the internet using me in this way. I'm going to send a DMCA notice. They end up kind of becoming the bad guys. So I can't speak too much of how this would work in actual politics, but I would say like the bias to embrace the internet and sort of laugh and have fun with things is the way that at least on the company side, like you kind of don't want the internet to hate you, right? You wouldn't want to dissuade your users for creating fun memes with your brand.
I mean, I'm sure Gavin Newsom would love to have a AI generated photo of him as like Captain America in like a superhero suit.
I'm sure it's also wildly different if other people do it and you kind of play off of it. I think from like our perspective, like as doing the client's work, I'd be surprised if they go that far. But I don't know, like we have a client who regularly makes photos in Midjourney. Like, can you include this in an email?
Yeah.
Whoever came up with the Biden mug with the dark Biden eyes is the best thing ever. Like that was a small stroke of brilliance. I love that.
Yeah, I feel like the Biden campaign is doing some interesting stuff with their kind of more sort of edgy sort of Twitter they put out where it's not actually President Biden tweeting, it's like Biden headquarters, and they're able to kind of embrace some of like more entertaining, more share-worthy type content where they might have to shy away from some of that a little bit with, you know, Biden social, like President Biden specific social. So I think that we'll probably see a lot of like more fun stuff come out of that. Like when they did the takeover, they had a placement on Fox News sites a while ago where anyone who visited Fox News saw the ad. So they're definitely doing some almost, or they just like had Biden join Truth Social and he has more followers than Trump, you know, like they're definitely being really creative with sort of, you know, stoking the fire a little bit there, which I think is really smart and good for the culture that we're living in right now.
I think so too. So I'm curious, you know, I know what goes into like, you know, the sort of Rockstar agency thing for corporate. What is, obviously both of you, but for like someone you hire, what does a Rockstar political marketing agency team member sort of look like? Like what are some of the attributes that if I were a marketer listening, I should aspire to?
I can go first, Celina. I'm sure Celina has lots of opinions too. I think one of the big things as a person coming from like, again, brand marketing, corporate marketing into the political space, I think the ability to sort of self-teach is really important. Like being able to like roll your sleeves up, figure out a problem, solve it on your own, ask the right questions that you need to, obviously, to get there, but don't be afraid to ask questions too, I guess is really important. But being able to kind of dive in and figure out things on your own a little bit at times, because there's not always, I think Authentic's done a really good job making like having staying powered infrastructure where we have like how-to guides and all types of onboarding materials. We've like done a really good job where like I know a lot of political jobs don't have that infrastructure at all, like because it's so cyclical. Back to what Celina was saying, a lot of that doesn't exist. So like I guess it's two-sided, right? Like being able to kind of go in and find stuff on your own because of that, but also like building that infrastructure for the future. So it's not everything lives in somebody's head, one person's head. You know what I mean? I think is a really big piece. I think being able to identify ways to prepare for rapid response opportunities, because when the news cycle happens, you don't want to be flat-footed if you have an ability to throw an ad up and raise a lot of money for your candidate. So I don't want to say like know how to predict the future, but it's more like there's things that you can specifically do to be prepared, like have copy and content ready to go and approved by the client before anything happens, like just being mindful of what's going on in the news cycle, if something might change, and being ready to act on it. So there's like a lot you can do. Also just talking to your clients in general and asking like, oh, what do you think is going to happen with that? Should we be prepared for that? I think is a really big piece. But I also think setting boundaries is a good one that we want to recommend for this type of work, because like I mentioned earlier, it can be really hard. The content of it can be really challenging at times because these are like, they have like real world implications, or at least in the US. So just being mindful of that, because again, there's so much talent that is in this space and comes and leaves and comes and goes because of some of that. So anything that you can do to sort of help mitigate that and set boundaries, I think is really important.
Yeah. Chris, this kind of goes back to something you said earlier too. I think there's a lot of super talented people in this industry that come from corporate backgrounds. I think you have to also really want to work in political marketing and political advertising. Like, I think as we've all discovered, there are a lot of weird quirks to it. And it also just like the day's news is going to change what happens. Like, I don't think all of us thought we'd be dealing with not having a Speaker of the House for multiple weeks. And that has thrown a wrench in a lot of copy and a lot of plans, because like we've historically messaged on Kevin McCarthy as a villain for a lot of our clients. You have to adapt to these things. And if you're not at least somewhat excited by it, and like you don't somewhat want to work on those timelines and like find that level of uncertainty, being on your feet, exciting, or like don't care about the cause, or some mix of all of them, I think it's not for everyone. And I think that's tough. But I think the people that like come in, want to learn, want to get their feet wet, it's a really, I think, a great opportunity. And I think there's a lot of room for us to learn from folks from more corporate backgrounds, because I think a lot of it is stuck in tradition and there's a lot that we can learn from. But I think that like willingness to learn, to dive in and to ride the roller coaster of Facebook could ban ads tomorrow and we don't really know, and deal with it, is also a quality that I think is really important.
Sounds like there's a lot of similarities between your space and the advertising world.
Yeah, we just have both. We're both advertising and political.
Buttons for punishment.
Some would say.
Adam, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, we're coming up to the hour, so we'll do one more question because I want to get some more cross-domain insight. So, Kat, I was stalking the website, and it's like super impressive. You guys, as an agency, have raised, I think it said over 200 million in fundraising, which is like a really cool stat. I'm curious. So a lot of our users are, D2C people. They're also a bunch of them are maybe doing, they're really early stage, and some of them are doing fundraising, like a GoFundMe type thing. And so we're trying to do the same thing to get their startup off the ground. Are there any learnings you can share from doing fundraising at scale for maybe like, people who are just starting out and can take some of the insights from, the big machine and sort of get it going for their smaller company?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like a couple things that come to mind is just, I think not being afraid to sort of dive in and embrace like taking a little bit of risk, I think is good. On the fundraising side, like we'll do a lot of creative things with other candidates. So for example, if you have one of our clients is a specific candidate that has some sort of like relevant or relevancy to another candidate, being able to like work together to split emails and fundraise separately, but like fundraise together in the same email. And for some of the newer candidates starting out, it's always good to sort of see if there's an ability to do that with some of the more established candidates, the candidates who have huge email lists, huge staying power. So I guess my lesson there too is like looking for ways to sort of partner with people who might have a little bit more infrastructure. I think is good. But I really do think like not being afraid to take risks is really important too. Because like putting something like, for us being digital practitioners, putting something on the internet that we're always asking ourselves, like, is this something that the campaign is comfortable with? Will they be okay? And obviously we get sign off and that sort of thing. And there's definitely times where the campaign will say, no, you cannot do that, even though we think it's a really great idea and it could really be effective. But I think if moving away from the political space, I feel like you probably have a little bit more wiggle room. Like, of course, like when I worked in corporate marketing, I will say, like when I worked on some of the bigger, like I had the Microsoft account and the Samsung account, their ability to let us sort of be creative when it comes to marketing is limited. But some of these smaller companies that we worked with were really more flexible, and we were able to like generate a lot more traction that way.
Yeah, I think this can be very tough for a lot of folks, but I think trusting in the process is a big part of that. Like, I think it takes some time for things to get off the ground. We pitch a lot of our clients on a lot of like acquisition work. We know it works. Like, you hire experts that have seen it before and are good at what they do, and you have to let them have the breathing room to do the things that they're telling you are going to be how you succeed. And I think obviously there's financial constraints, but I think like when we sign small congressional candidates that are just launching, like we're like, these are the best 3 things you can do. And a lot of times they come back to us they say no. And then 5 months later, they're like, well, we want to do it now. And we're like, well, we still can, but like, it's not going to work that well at this stage in the game. So hire a good team, listen to your team.
Awesome.
And do co-marketing, basically what it sounds like, right? So Adam, we should be taking notes for when I run for governor of Washington here.
Well, Chris, we're going to use AdQuick to put your face on billboards on everyone's ride to get coffee and to the office and whatnot. So, well, great. Where can we go to connect with both of you? Or if we're a policymaker and want to get your help with our next political campaign, this is your opportunity to plug what you guys are doing.
Awesome. Yeah, you can definitely reach me on LinkedIn, on Twitter. It's my name. And then if you have an interest in working with Authentic, hello@authentic.org is sort of our email address where we can access any potential incoming inquiries. So we'd love to work with you.
Amazing. Yes. And LinkedIn as well, but you can also sporadically find me on Twitter as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for being on the podcast. I'm still doing the YouTuber thing. So if you are watching this on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe below. And we will see all of you next week. Thank you for tuning in.